Bam. 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 All right, looks good. Actually working. Do. Make sure it's all queued up. Looks good. Test, test, test. Really? Is it no sound detected? Is it lying to me? I think it's working. Alright. Yeah, I think it sounds fine. Alright. We have gotten through. We are past the halfway point now. We have made it. We've done it. We've gotten to the halfway point of the Federalist Papers. These are what Madison, Hamilton were writing right after the Revolution. We tried the Articles of Confederation. They were failing miserably. There was a lot of problems. So they got together the Constitutional Convention, and they were going, okay, what do we got to do? We got to figure something out here. We got to try something different because the articles aren't working out. So they wrote the Constitution, but their fight wasn't over. They needed to convince all the states to start ratifying it, to accept the Constitution, that this was going to be it, that this was going to be the law of the land. I guess I should wait for my, but anyway, so they started writing the Articles of the Federalist Papers to try to convince people, like, all right, try to convince the states, the voters, the politicians to switch over, that, hey, this is what we need to do, since the Articles of Confederation were such a failure. Like, all right, so they're sending out these newsletters, the Federalist Papers, what they ended up calling them. They started sending out these newsletters trying to convince all the states to start ratifying them, and it worked. It worked, and now now it's this explanation of we have this explanation of the Constitution. Them defending it, what they wrote, and so you get a much better understanding of the Constitution through this. But anyway, all right. So let's do number 44. Restriction on the authority of several states. This was Madison, and this was first posted in New York. So they all will say, to the people of the state of New York. A fifth class of provisions in favor of the federal authority consist of the following restrictions on the authority of the several states. All right, so this is when they start writing about the part of the Constitution, the supremacy clause of the Constitution, that it has this power of the states. This is really contentious between a lot of states that want to ratify it because of this superiority clause, that the Constitution is over the state laws. No state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, confederation, grant letters of marque or reprisal, coin money, emit bills of credit, make thing but gold and silver, legal tender and payments of debts, pass any bill of attainder, ex post fasto, or law impairing the obligation of contracts, or grant any title of nobility. So he's directly quoting the Constitution there, and then he's going to give his defense of it. Though prohibition against treaties, alliances, confederations make a part of the existing articles of the Union, and for the reasons which need no explanation, is copied into the new Constitution. This was a big problem because each states during the Articles of Confederation, they were having a lot of problems with, like, each state was trying to make deals with other countries, and so we would have, instead of having a trade deal with another country, we would have 13 trade deals, and it's a lot of confusion and a lot of problems. The prohibition of letters of marque is another part of the old system, but is somewhat somewhat extended into the new. According to the former, letters of marque could be granted by states after the declaration of war. According to the latter, these licenses must be obtained as well as during war as previous of its declaration. So letters of marque are legal piracy. You are allowed to go. It's like the state. All the countries did this. They would go, hey, we're at war with England, so we will give you a letter of marque. This gives you the legal right to go pirate their merchant ships. From the government in the United States, this alteration is fully justified by the advantages of uniformity in all points which relate to foreign powers, and of immediate responsibility to the nation and all those whose conduct the nation itself is to be responsible. The right of coining money, which is here taken from the states, was left in their hands by the Confederation, and as a concurrent right with Congress under the exception in new favor of exclusive rights of Congress to regulate the alloy in value. This is another point. We also had 13 different kinds of coinage and paper. So, imagine like every time you just like went across state lines, you had to like exchange all your money for the, I got to go to New Hampshire. I got to change out all my money. In this instance, also, the new provision is an improvement on the old. Whilst the alloy and value depended on the general authority, a right of coinage in particular states could have no other effect than to multiply expensive mints and diversify the forms and weights of the circulating pieces. The latter inconveniency defeats one purpose for which the power was originally submitted to the federal head, and as far as the former might prevent an inconvenient remittance of gold and silver to the central mint of recoinage, and the end can as well be attained by the local mints established under the general authority. And it also, now we have a consolidated coinage, we have a consolidated currency, so a lot more easy, and it's going to be a lot cheaper to promote the exchange of goods and get the economy moving. The extension of the prohibition to bills of credit must give pleasure to every citizen, in proportion to his love of justice and his knowledge of the true springs of public prosperity. The loss which America has sustained since the peace from the pestilent effects of paper money on the necessary confidence between man and man, on the necessary confidence in the public councils, on the industry and morals of the people, and on the character of the republican government, constituents an enormous debt against the states, charitable with the unadvised measure, which must remain unsatisfied. Yeah, the first continental dollar, right after the revolution and during the revolution, it got inflated to an insane degree, which they were like paying things with crates of money. They would take they'd be paying people with they'd be weighing it instead of counting it, because it had inflated to such a ridiculous amount, or rather an accumulation of guilt, and which can be expiated no other than by a voluntary sacrifice on the altar of justice, of the power of which has been the instrument of it. In addition to these persuasive conditions, it may be observed that the same reasons which show the necessity of denying to the states the power of regulating coin prove with equal force that they ought not to be the liberty or to substitute a paper medium in the place of coin. Every state had a right to regulate the value of coin, which might be as many different currencies as the state, and thus the intercourse among them would be impeded. Retrospective alterations in this value might be made, and thus the citizens of other states be injured, the animosities and kindling among the states themselves. So there was also a lot of bickering between the states about hey, you're using only 90% silver, we're using 95. It's why is our coinage being counted the same as yours? So in this centralized mint, you don't have that issue. The subjects of foreign powers might suffer from the same cause, and hence the union be discredited and embroiled by the indiscretion of a single member. This was another problem. A lot of foreign powers, it's you're doing all these trade, and it's all 13 colonies are trading with Spain, but New Hampshire does some shady stuff, and it's Spain's well, it's no, that's just New Hampshire, that's not the rest of it. It's well, you're supposed to be one country, I'm supposed to be trading with you guys, why am I making 13 different freaking treaties? No one of these mischiefs is less incident to power than in states to emit paper money than to coin gold or silver. The power to make anything but gold and silver a tender in payment of debts is withdrawn from the states, on the same principle that the issuing of paper currency, bills of attainder, ex post facto laws, and laws impairing the obligation of contracts are contrary to the first principles of the social compact and to every principle of sound legislation. The two former are expressly prohibited by the declarations prefixed in some of the state constitutions, and all of them are prohibited by the spirit and scope of these fundamental charters. Our own expertise has taught us, nevertheless, that additional fences against these dangers ought not to be omitted. Very properly, therefore, we have a convention added to the constitutional bulwark in favor of personal security and private rights, and I am much deceived if they have not, in so doing, as faithful consulted in genuine sentiments as the undoubted interest of their constituents. The sober people of America are wary of the fluctuating policies which has directed the public councils. They have seen with great regret and indignation that sudden changes and legislative interferences in cases affecting personal rights become jobs in the hand of enterprising and influential interference is but the first link in the chain of repetitions. Every subsequent interference being naturally produced by the effects of the preceding. They very rightly infer, therefore, that some throughout reform is wanting, which will banish speculations on public measures, inspire a general prudence and industry, and give regular course of the business of society. There's another problem with the fluctuating currency and valuation of the continental script. At the time, it was like people were speculating wildly on just like how bad it was going to get because it was going so crazy. There's a kind of a infamous story of this famous guy who was known for being really kind of dumb but kind of lucking into a lot of power. He bought on bad business advice from a guy that was trying to screw him over to buy a bunch of continental script because they were like, it's worthless and we're going to get him to buy a bunch of it. But then Congress eventually came out and said, okay, we'll buy back all the continental script for 10% value. And he was just like an insanely rich man because somebody tried to trick him into making a bad business decision. The prohibition with respect to titles of nobility is copied from the Articles of Confederation and needs no comment. This was that you can have no kings, queens, dukes, things like that. That is illegal by the Constitution. No state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any impost on duties or imports or exports, except what they may absolutely necessary for executing the inspection laws. So a state can't have a tariff. The only exception in the Constitution is that you can have a tariff to just pay like the impost guys, the guys that are like at the docks, going, oh, here, there. You can have a tariff to pay for those guys. That's the only thing. And, upkeeping of the docks. That's the only way a state can have a tariff. And the net produce of all duties and imposts laid by any state on imports or exports shall be the use of the Treasury of the United States. All such laws shall be subject to the revision and control of the Congress. No state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any duty on tonnage, keep troops or ships of war in times of peace, enter into any agreement or compact with another state or foreign power, or engage in war unless actually invaded, or in such imminent dangers as they will not adamant of delay. The restraint on the power of the states over imports and exports is enforced by all arguments which prove the necessity of submitting the regulation of trade to the federal councils. It is needless, therefore, to remark further on this head, than that the manner in which the restraint is qualified seems well calculated at once to secure the states a reasonable discretion in providing for the conveyancy of their imports and exports. In the United States, a remarkable check against the abuse of this discretion. Because they were having a lot of problems with this, the states doing like their own little taxes on everyone instead of having, say you wanted to ship something from Canada to Florida and you wanted to, best way, go through the United States. If it had to stop each state, pay a tariff on each one or pay an impost on each one, it would just stop, trade, which is becoming a real problem. The remaining particulars of this clause fall within reasoning, which are either so obvious or have been fully developed that they may have passed over without remark. The sixth and last class consists of the several powers and provisions by which efficiency is given to all the rest. 1. Of these, the first is the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying out into the execution of foreign powers and all other powers vested in the Constitution, in the government of the United States, or in any department or officer thereof. Few parts of the Constitution have been assailed with such impertinence than this, yet on a fair investigation of it, no part can appear more completely invulnerable. Without the substance of this power, the whole Constitution could be dead letter. Those who object to the article, therefore, as part of the Constitution, can only mean that the form of the provision is improper. So he's attacking the people attacking this clause of the Constitution. He's countering their counter-argument. But have they considered whether a better form could have been substituted? There are 4 other possible methods which the Constitution might have taken on this subject. They might have copied the second article of the existing Confederation, which have prohibited the exercise of any power not expressly delegated. They might have attempted a positive enumeration of the powers comprehended under the general terms, necessary and proper. They might have attempted a negative enumeration of them by specifying the powers excepted from the general definition. They might have been altogether silent on the subject, leaving these necessary and proper powers to the construction and interference. Had the conviction, so he's laying out the arguments against this form of the Constitution, so he's probably going to go in and say like why these arguments are bad. Had the convention taken the first method of adopting the second article of the Confederation, it is evident that the new Congress would have been continually exposed, as their predecessors have been, to the alternate of the constructing term of expressly, with so much rigor as to disarm the government of all real authority whatsoever, with such a latitude to destroy altogether the force of restriction. Okay, so the first argument is that the articles are... The first argument against this is bad because we tried that under the Articles of Confederation. It failed. It would be easy to show, if it were necessary, that no important power delegated to the Articles of Confederation has been or can be executed by Congress without recurring more or less to the doctrine of construction and implication, as the powers delegated under the new system are more extensive. The government, which is to administer it, would find itself still more distressed without the alternative of betraying the public interest by doing nothing, or by violating the Constitution by exercising powers indispensably necessary and proper, but at the same time not expressly granted. Had the convention attempted a positive enumeration of the powers necessary and proper for carrying out their own powers into effect, the attempt would have involved a complete digest of laws on every subject where the Constitution relates. All right, so the second argument is that you should have listed out all the necessary and proper, quote-unquote, powers of Congress. And he's like, if we did that, we would basically, the Constitution would just be a law book. It wouldn't be a framework to create a government. It would just be a law book. Not only to the existing state of things, but all to the possible changes which future may produce. For in every new application of a general power, the particular powers which are meant to be attaining of the object of the general power must always necessarily vary with that object, and often properly varied whilst the object remains the same. Had they attempted to enumerate the particular powers or means not necessary or proper for carrying out the general powers into execution, the task would have been no less chimerical and would have been liable to this further objection, that every defect in the enumeration would have been equivalent and positive grant of authority. If to avoid this consequence, they had attempted the partial enumeration of the exemptions and described the residue by the general terms not necessary or proper, it must have happened that the enumeration would have comprehended a few of the accepted powers only, and that these would be least likely to be assumed or tolerated, because the enumeration would of course select such would be the least necessary or proper, and that the unnecessary and improper powers included in the residuum, Latin, the residuum, I don't know if anyone knows Latin, but I'm going to go residuum, would be less forcibly accepted than if no partial enumeration had been made. Had the Constitution been silent on this head, there can be no doubt that the particular powers requisite as means of executing the general powers would have resulted to the government by unavoidable implication. No axiom is more clearly established in law or in reason than what, wherever the end is required, the means are authorized. Wherever a general power to do a thing is given, every particular power necessary for doing it is included. Had this last method therefore been pursued by the convention, every objection now urged against the plan would remain in all its plausibility, and in every real inconveniency would be incurred of not removing a pretext which may be seized on the critical occasion. For drawing into question the essential powers of the Union, if it be asked what is to be the consequence in case the Congress shall misconstrue this part of the Constitution and exercise powers not warranted by its true meaning, I answer, the same as it would be misconstrued or enlarged by any other power vested in them. As if the general power had been reduced to the particulars, and if any one of these were to be violated, the same. In short, if the state legislators should violate the irrespective constitutional authorities, in the first instance, the success of the usurpation will depend on the executive and judiciary departments, which are to expound and give effect to the legislative acts. All right, so this is kind of a good point. It's like a lot of the detractors are going, okay, you should have like listed them out or listed the ones that are not due. You know, this leaves it open to be violated. And he's like, if they're going to violate it, they're going to violate it. That's the job of the judiciary and the executive to be the counterbalance, to be the co-equal branch to counteract these things. This is not the job of the framing. And in the last resort, a remedy must be obtained from the people who can, by the election of more faithful representatives, and the people. Annul the acts of usurpers. The truth is that the ultimate redress must be more confined in against unconstitutional acts of the federal than of the state legislators, for this plain reason that every such act of the former will be an invasion of the rights of the latter. These will be ever ready to mark the innovation, to sound the alarm to the people, and to exert their local influence in effecting the change of federal representatives. There being no such intermediate body between state legislators and the people interested in watching the conduct of the former, violation of the state constitutions are more likely to remain unnoticed and unredressed. 2. The Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. And anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary, notwithstanding, quotation, the indiscreet zeal of the adversaries to the Constitution have betrayed them into attack on this part of it also, without which would have been the evidently and radically defective. To be fully sensible of this, we need not only suppose for a moment that the supremacy of the state constitutions have been left complete by saving clause in their favor. In the first place, as these constitutions invest in the state legislators with absolute sovereignty in all cases not accepted by the existing Articles of Confederation, all the authorities contained in the proposed Constitution, so far as they exceed the enumerated in the Confederation, would have been annulled, and the new Congress would have been reduced to the same impotent conditions as their predecessors. Back to this point that if we did it this way, we're just going back to the Articles, and we're going to be in the same boat we are now, and we're trying to fix it. In the next place, as the constitutions of some of the states do not evenly even expressly and fully recognize the existing powers of the Confederacy, an express saving of the supremacy of the former would, in such states, have been brought into question every power contained in the proposed Constitution. The third place, as the Constitution of the United States differ much from each other, it might happen that a treaty or national law of great or equal importance to the states would interfere with some and not with other constitutions, and would consequently be valid in some of the states at the same time that it would have no effect in others. In fine, the world would have seen for the first time a system of government founded on the inversion of fundamental principles of government. It would have seen the authority of the whole society everywhere subordinate to the authority of its parts. It would have seen a monster in which the head was under the direction of its members. So the point of the articles, a lot of these, the state constitution, were not listening to the federal government. They weren't doing it. So it was like, if one state didn't want to do something, none of the states got that law. And then some of them would have to. It was such a mess. The articles were such a mess. All right, sorry. I don't know why my phone only gives me alerts sometimes. The senators and representatives of the members of the several state legislatures and all executives and judicial officers, both in the United States and several states, shall be bound by the oath or affirmation to support this Constitution. It has been asked, why was it thought necessary that the state magistrate should be bound to the support of the federal Constitution, and unnecessarily that, like the oath, should be imposed on the officers of the United States in favor of the state constitutions? Several reasons might be assigned for this distinction. I content myself with one, which is obvious and conclusive. The members of the federal government will have no agency in carrying the state constitutions into effect. The members and officers of the state governments, on the contrary, will have the essential agency in giving the effect of the federal constitution. The election of the president and senate will depend in all cases on the legislature of the several states, and the election of the House of Representatives will equally depend on the same authority in the first instance, and will probably forever be conducted by the officers and according to the laws of the states. 4. Among the provisions for giving efficacy to the federal powers might be added to those which belong to the executive and judiciary departments, but as these are reserved for particular examination in another place, I pass them over this. We have now reviewed in detail all the articles composing the sum quantity of powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government. We are brought to this undeniable conclusion that no part of this power is unnecessary or improper for accommodating the necessary objects of the Union. The question, therefore, whether this amount of power shall be granted or not, resolves itself into another question, which is whether or not a government commensurate with the exigencies of the Union shall be established, or, in other words, whether the Union itself shall be preserved. Ooh. He ends on a hard line. He's like, y'all are asking the wrong questions. Y'all need to ask yourself, do you want the Union or not? And as always, he ends at Publius. All right. All right, that's number 44. Going on to 45. The alleged dangers from the power of union to the state governments considered. So he's still talking about this lots of contention between people that were worried about the new Constitution infringing or imposing limitations on the state government's kind of powers. James Madison again. Haven't seen Hamilton in a little bit, but I guess Hamilton got tired of it. Or he got in trouble doing something. To the people of the state of New York. Having shown that no one of the powers transferred to the federal government is unnecessary or improper, the next question is to be considered is whether the whole mass of them will be dangerous to the portion of the authority left to the several states. The adversaries to this plan of the convention, instead of considering the first place what degree of power was absolutely necessary for the purposes of the federal government, have exhausted themselves in a secondary inquiry into the possible consequences of the proposed degree of power of the government of the particular states. So he's like going, all right, my detractors, they're going, oh, look at all the problems. Look at all the problems this is going to cause the states. He's like, you're asking the wrong question. The question is, how much power should we give to the federal government for the federal government to run and exist as an entire country? You need to, then you can go on to the next question of how to limit that power. But you need to find your floor of power. But if the Union, as it has been shown, be essential to the security of the people of America against foreign danger, it is essential to their security against the contention and wars among the different states. If it be essential to guard them against those violent and oppressive factions which embitter the blessings of liberty, and against those military establishments which must gradually poison its very foundation. If, in a word, the Union be essential to the happiness of the people of America, it is not preposterous to urge as an objection to the government, without which the objects of the Union cannot be attained, that such a government may I do not know this word. Derogate. We'll just say distract from the importance of the government in the individual states. Was then the American Revolution effected? Was the American Confederacy formed? Was the precious blood of the thousands spilt, and the hard-earned subsistence of millions lavished, not that the people of America should enjoy peace, liberty, and safety, but that the government of the individual states, that particular municipal establishments might enjoy a certain extent of power, and be arrayed with certain dignities and attributes of sovereignty? We have heard of the impious, I was having trouble, doctrine in the old world, that the people were made for kings, not kings for the people, and the same doctrine to be revived in the new, in another shape, that the solid happiness of the people is to be sacrificed to the views of political institutions of a different form. It is too early for politicians to presume on our forgetting that the public good, the real welfare of the great body of the people, is the supreme object to be pursued, and that no form of government whatever has an other value as it may be fitted to the attainment of this object. Were the plan of the convention adverse to the public happiness, my voice would be, reject the plan. Were the Union itself inconsistent with the public happiness, it would be, abolish the Union. In like manner, as far as the sovereignty of the states cannot be reconciled to the happiness of the people, the voice of every good citizen must be. Let the former be sacrificed to the latter. How far the sacrifice is necessary has been shown. How far the unsacrificed residue will be endangered is the question before us. Several important considerations have been touched in the course of these papers, which discontent the supposition of the operation of the federal government will by degrees prove fatal to the state governments. The more I revolve the subject, the more fully I am persuaded that the balance is much more likely to be disturbed by the preponderancy of the last than of the first scale. We have seen, in all the examples of ancient and modern confederacies, the strongest tendencies continually betraying itself in the members, to despoil the general government of its authorities, and with the very ineffectual capacity in the latter to defend itself against encroachments. Although in most of these examples, the system has been so dissimilar from the under the consideration as to greatly weaken the interference concerning the latter from the fate of the former, yet, as the state will remain under the proposed constitution a very extensive proportion of active sovereignty. The interference ought to be wholly disregarded. In the Acadian League, he loves bringing up the Acadian League. It is probable that the federal head had a degree and species of power which gave it considerable likeness to the government framed by the convention. The Lacadian Confederacy, as far as the principles and forms are transmitted, must have been borne a single and greater analogy to it. Yet history does not inform us that either of them ever degenerated or tended to degenerate into one consolidated government. On the contrary, we know that the ruin of one of them proceeded from the incapacity of the federal authority to prevent the dissensions and finally the disunion. The subordinate authorities, these cases are more worthy of our attention, as the external causes of the component parts were pressed together, which were much more numerous and powerful than in our case. All right, so he's like, the problems with these confederacies were not that they were too centralized, it's that they weren't centralized enough, and they broke apart in their constituent parts as soon as they had pressure. So that argument of the Constitution is weak in his opinion. And consequently, less powerful ligaments within would be sufficient to bind the members to the head and to each other. In the feudal system, we have seen similar propensity exemplified, notwithstanding the want of proper sympathy in every instance between the local sovereignties and the people, and the sympathy in some instances between the general sovereign and the latter. It usually happens that the local sovereigns prevailed in the rivalship for encroachments. Had no external dangers enforced internal harmony and subordination, in particular, had the local sovereigns possessed the affections of the people, the great kingdoms in Europe would have at this time consisted of many independent princes, as there were former feudatory barons. The state governments will have the advantage of the federal government, whether we compare them in respect to immediate dependence of one another, to the weight of personal influence which will possess the powers respectively vested to them, in the predilection and probable support of the people to the disposition and faculty of resisting and frustrating the measures of each other. The state governments may be regarded as a constituent and essential parts of the federal government, while the latter is nowise essential to the operation or organization of the former. So he's arguing that the state governments actually have a lot of power. It's like the state governments have a lot of sway in the federal government. The federal government does not have a lot of sway in the state governments. So he's like, don't worry, guys. You're still okay. Without the intervention of the state legislators, the President of the United States cannot be elected at all. They must in all cases have a great share in his appointment and will perhaps, in most cases, of themselves determine it. The Senate will be elected absolutely and exclusively by state legislators. I hate to tell them about what happened later. Even the House of Representatives, though drawn immediately from the people, will be chosen very much under the influence of that class of men. Those influence over the people obtain themselves an election into the state legislators. Thus, each of the principal branches of the federal government will owe its existence more or less to the favor of the state governments, and must consequently feel a dependence, which is much more likely to beget disposition too obsequious than too overbearing to them. On the other side, the component parts of the state government will in no instances be indebted for their appointment to the direct agencies of the federal government, and very little, if at all, to the local influence of its members. The number of individuals employed under the Constitution of the United States will be much smaller than the number of employed under the particular states. There will consequently be less of personal influence on the side of the former than of the latter. The members of the legislative, executive, and judiciary departments of 13 and more states, the justices of peace, officers of the militia, ministers, officers of justice, with all the country, corporation, and town officers, for the millions and more people intermixed and having particular acquaintances with every class of circle of people, must exceed beyond all proportion, both in number and influence, those every description who are employed in the administration of the federal system. Compare the members of 3 great departments of 13 states, excluded from the Judiciary Department, the Justices of Peace, with the members of the corresponding departments of single government of the Union, compared the militia officers of 3 millions of people with military and marine officers of established, which is the compass of probability, or I may add, of possibility in this view alone, we may pronounce the advantage of the states to be decisive. If the federal government is to have collectors of revenue, the state governments will have theirs also. And as those of the former will be principally on the sea coast and not very numerous, while those of the latter will be spread over the face of the country and will be very numerous, the advantage in this view also lies on the same side. So he's still just going over these reasons, like trying to cajole or calm down the people that are worried about the loss of the. He's like, look at all these powers the states are still going to have. It is true the Confederacy is to possess and may exercise the power of collecting internal as well as external taxes throughout the states, but it is probable that this power will not be resorted to except for supplemental purposes of revenue, and that an option will then be given to the states to supply their quotas by previous collections of their own, and that the eventual collection under the immediate authority of the Union will generally be made by the officers and according to the rules appointed by the several states. Indeed, it is extremely probable that the other instances, particularly in the organization of judicial power, the officers of the states will be clothed with the correspondent authority of the Union. Should it happen, however, that separate collectors of internal revenue should be appointed under the federal government, the influence of the whole number would not bear comparison with that of the multitude of state officers in the opposite scale. I feel like Madison has definitely gotten better. As he still has these like clunky run-on sentences, but they're a lot less as he's gone on. Within every district to which the federal collector would be allotted, there would be not less than 30 or 40 or even more officers of different descriptions, and many of them persons of character and weight, whose influence would lie on the side of the state. The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The former would be exercised principally on the external objects as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce, with which the last power of taxation will be, for the most part, be connected. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all objects which, in the ordinary course of affairs, concern the lives, liberties, properties of the people, and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the states. The operations of the federal government will be most extensive and important in times of war and danger, those in the state government in times of peace and security, as the former periods will probably bear a small proportion to the latter. The state governments will here enjoy another advantage over the federal government. The more adequate, indeed, the federal powers may be rendered to the national defense, the less frequent it will those senses of danger which might favor their ascendancy over the governments of the particular states. If the new Constitution be examined with accuracy and candor, it will be found that the changes which it proposes consist much less in the addition of new powers to the Union than the invigoration of its original powers. The regulation of commerce, it is true, is a new power, but that seems to be an addition which few oppose, and for which no apprehensions are entertained. The powers relating to war and peace, armies and fleets, treaties and finance, with the others more considerable powers, are all vested in the existing Congress by the Articles of Confederation. The proposed change does not enlarge these powers, it only substitutes a more effectual model of administrating them. It's like we're not adding to the federal government's power, we're just making so these powers make sense and can actually be used. We're not giving more powers than the articles did. The change relating to taxation may be regarded as the most important, and yet the present Congress has a complete authority to require of the state indefinite supplies of money for the common defense and general welfare. As for the future, Congress will have to require them of individual citizens, and the latter will be no more bound than the states themselves have been, to pay the quotas respectfully taxed on them. Had the states complied punctually with the orders of Confederation, or had their compliance been enforced by peaceable means, as may be used to the success towards single persons. Our past experience is very far from continuance an option that the state governments would have lost their constitutional powers and have gradually undergone an entire consolidation. To mean that such an event would have ensued, they would have to say at once that the existence of the state governments is incompatible with any system whatsoever that accomplishes the essential purposes of the Union. Publius. All right, it's number 45. I'm still feeling. How long have we been going? Yeah, I'm fine. We can do at least another one. All right. 46. Madison again. The influence of state and federal governments compared. Okay, so he's still on this point. A lot of people really apprehensive of the Constitution, this seemingly power imbalance between the states and federal government in comparison to the Articles of Confederation. All right. Resuming the subject of the last paper, I proceed to inquire whether the federal government or state governments will have the advantage with regard to the predilection and support of the people. Notwithstanding the different models in which they are appointed, we must consider both of them as substantially dependent on the great body of the citizens of the United States. I assume this position here as it respects the first, reserving the proofs for another place. The federal and state governments are in fact but different agents and trustees of the people, constituted with different powers and designating for a different purpose. The advisaries of the Constitution seem to have lost sight of the people altogether in their reasoning on this subject, and to have viewed these different establishments not only as mutual rivals and enemies, but as uncontrolled by the common superior in their efforts to usurp the authority of each other. These gentlemen must here be reminded of their error. They must be told that the ultimate authority, wherever the derivative may be found, resides in the people alone, and that they will not depend merely on the comparative ambition or address the different governments, whether either or which of them will be able to enlarge its sphere of jurisdiction at the expense of the other. Truth, no less than decency, requires that the event in every case should be supposed to depend on the sentiments and sanctions of the common constituents. Many considerations, besides those suggested on a former occasion, seem to place it beyond doubt that the first and most natural attachment of the people will be to the governments of their respective states. I wonder if that still holds up. Do you think most people still feel like they're more attached to their state than the country? I don't think it's that true. Maybe Texans. Californians. Into the administration of the greater number of individuals will expect to rise. From the gift of the greater numbers of offices and annulments will flow, by the superintending care of these, all the more domestic and personal interest of the people will be regulated and provided for. With the affairs of these, the people will be more familiarly and minutely conversant, and with the members of these will be a greater proportion of the people have the ties of personal acquaintance and friendship, and of family of party attachments. On the side of these, therefore, the popular bias will be expected most strongly to incline. Okay, I gotta take a drink. Experience speaks the same language in this case. The federal administration though hitherto very defective in comparison with which may be hoped under the better system, had during the war, and particularly whilst the independent fund of paper emissions was in credit, an activity and importance as great as this can be well have future circumstances whatsoever. It was engaged too in course of the measures which had for their object the protection of everything that was dear, and the acquisition of everything that could be desirable to the people at large. It was, nevertheless, invariably found, after the transient enthusiasm for the early Congress was over, that the attention and attachment of the people were turned anew to their own particular governments, that the Federal Council was no more time to idle of popular favor, and that the opposition to proposed enlargements of this power and importance was the side usually taken by men who wished to build their political consequence on the prepossessions of their fellow citizens. If, therefore, has been elsewhere remarked, the people should in the future become more partial to the federal than to the state governments. The change can only result from such manifest and irresistible proof of a better administration as will overcome all their I don't know this word.
Antecedent.
Antecedent propensities, and that in that case the people ought to not surely be precluded from giving the most of their confidence where they may discover it to be due. But even in that case of state governments could have little to apprehend, because it is only within a certain sphere that the federal power can, in the nature of things, be advantageously administered. The remaining points on which I propose to compare the federal and state governments, and the disposition and the faculty they may respectively possess, to resist and frustrate the measures of each other, it has been already proved that the members of the federal will be more dependent on the members of the state governments than the latter be on the former. It may also appear that the prepossessions of the people on whom both will be depending will be more on the side of the state governments than on the federal government. So far, the disposition of each towards each other may be influenced by the causes of the state governments must clearly have the advantage. So, this was very true. The state people really back then were like, I'm a New Hampshireite, and then I'm American. That has changed over time. So this point falls a little flatter than it probably did back then. It definitely, if that really broke after the Civil War. After the Civil War, people really kind of like viewed that differently. But in a distinct and very important point of view, the advantage will lie on the same side. The prepossessions for which the members themselves will carry into the federal government will generally be favorable to the states, while it will rarely happen that the members of the state governments will carry into the public councils a bias in favor of the general government. A local spirit will infallibly prevail much more in the members of Congress than a national spirit will prevail in the legislative of particular states. Everyone knows that a great proportion of the errors committed by the state legislators proceeds from the disposition of the members to sacrifice the comprehensive and permanent interest of the state to the particular and separate views of the countries or districts in which they reside, counties or districts which they reside, and if they do not sufficiently enlarge their policy to embrace the collective welfare of their particular state, how can it be imagined that they will make the aggregate propensity of the Union, and that the dignity and respectability of its government, the objects and their affections, be consolations, for the same reason that the members of the state legislators will unlikely to attach themselves sufficiently to national objects. The members of the federal legislative will be likely to attach themselves too much to local objects. The states will be to the latter what counties and towns are to the former. Measures will often be decided according to their probable effect, not only on the national propensity and happiness, but on the prejudiced interest and pursuits of the government of the people of the individual states. So this, I think, point still holds up, that you're still going to have politicians that are going to come in and vote for their particular states, even if the federal government is more powerful than the state governments. What is the spirit that has in general characterized the proceeding of Congress? A perusal of their journals, as well as the candid acknowledgments of such as had a seat in that assembly, will inform us that the members have but too frequently displayed the character rather of partisans of their respective states than of the impartial guardians of the common interest. That where on one occasion improper sacrifices have been made of local considerations to the aggrandizement, I can't ever say that word, the beginning of the federal government, the great interest of the nation have suffered on 100 from an undue attention to the local prejudices, interests, and views of particular states. I mean not by these reflections to insinuate that the new federal government will not embrace a more enlarged plan of policies than the existing government may have pursued, much less than its views will be confined as those of the state legislators, but only that it will partake sufficiently in the spirit of both to be disinclined to invade the rights of individual states or the prerogatives of their governments. The motives on this part of the state governments to augment their prerogatives by defalcations from the federal government will be overruled by no reciprocal predispositions in the members. Were it admitted, however, that the federal government may feel an equal disposition with the state governments to extend power beyond the due limits, the latter will still have the advantage in the means of defeating such encroachments. If an act of a particular state, though unfriendly to the national government, be genuinely popular in the state, and should not too grossly violate the oaths of the state officers, it is to be executed immediately and, of course, by means on the spot and depending on the state alone. The opposition of the federal government or the interposition of the federal officers would but inflame and zeal all the parties on the side of the state, and that the evil could not be prevented or repaired, if at all, without the employment of means in which must always be resorted with the reluctance and difficulty. On the other hand, should an unwarranted measure of the federal government be unpopular in a particular state, which would seldom fail to be the case, or even a warrantable measure be so, which would sometimes be the case, the means of opposition to it are powerful and at hand. The delinquents of the people and their repugnance and perhaps refusal to cooperate with the officers of the Union, the frowns and executive magistracy of the state. I always love something like this when the Founding Fathers says something that's so apt in modern times. It's like, the states do have powers. If the people are repugnant by an authority, they can just refuse to cooperate with the officers of the Union. You see that happening. How are you detecting? And I've been not stopped talking this whole time, and you're yelling at me all right. The frowns of the executive magistracy of the state, the embarrassments created by, is it picking up? Yeah, it's picking up. I don't know why it's saying that. The frowns and executive magistracy of the state, the embarrassments created by the legislative devices, which often be added on such occasions, would oppose in any state difficulties not to be despised, would form in a large state very serious impediments, and where the sentiments of several adjoining states happen to be in unison, would present obstructions which the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. But ambitious encroachments of the federal government on the authority of a state government would not excite the opposition of a single state or of a few states only. They would be signals of general alarm. Every government should espouse the common cause. The correspondence would be opened. Plans of residence would be concerted. One spirit would animate and conduct the whole. The same combinations, in short, would result from an apprehension of the federal, as well as produced by the dread of a foreign yoke. And unless the projected innovations should be voluntarily renounced, the same appeal to a trial of force would be made in one case as was made by the other. But what degree of madness could ever drive the federal government to such an extremity? In the contrast with Great Britain, one part of the empire has been employed against the other. The more numerous part invaded the rights of the less numerous parts. The attempt was unjust and unwise, but it was not the speculation, absolution, chimerical. But what would the contest in the case we are supposing? Who would be the parties? A few representatives of the people would be opposed to the people themselves, or rather, one set of representatives would be contending against 13 sets of representatives, with the whole body of their common constituents on the side of the latter. The only refuge left for those whose prophesy the downfall of the state governments is the visionary supposition that the federal government may be previously accumulate a military force for the projects of ambition. The reasoning contained in these papers must have been employed with very little purpose indeed, if it could be necessary now to disprove the reality of this danger, that the people and the states should, for a sufficient period of time, and elect an uninterrupted succession of men ready to betray both, that the traitors should, throughout this period, uniformly and systematically pursue some fixed plan for the extension of the military establishment, that the government and the people of the states should silently and patiently behold the gathering storm, and continue to supply the materials until it should be prepared to burst on their heads, must appear to every one more like an incoherent dream of a delirious jealousy, or a misjudged exaggeration of counterfeit zeal, than like of the sober apprehensions of genuine patriotism. Extravagant at the supposition is, let it however be made, let a regular army fully equal to the resources of the country be formed, and let it be entirely at the devotion of the federal government. Still, it would not be going too far to say that the state governments, with the people on their side, would be able to repel the danger. The highest number to which, according to the best computation, a standing army can be carried in any country does not exceed 1/100th part of the whole number of souls, or 1/25th part of the number of able bear arms. This proportion would not yield in the United States an army of more than 25 or 30,000 men. To these would be opposed a militia amounting near 500,000 citizens with arms in their hands, officered by men chosen from among themselves, fighting for their common liberties, and united in conducting governments, possessing an affection and confidence. It may well be doubted whether a militia thus circumcised could ever be conquered by such a proportion of regular troops. Those who are at best acquainted with the last successful resistance in this country against the British arms will be most inclined to deny the possibility of it. Besides, the advantage of being armed with which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation, that one's still true. The existence of a subordinate government to which the people are attached and by which the militia officers are appointed, forms a barrier against the enterprises of ambition, more insurmountable than any which simple government of any form can admit it. Notwithstanding, the military establishments in the several kingdoms of Europe, which are carried as far as the public resources will bear, the governments are afraid to trust the people with arms. And it is not certain that the governments chosen by themselves, who could collect the national will and direct the national force, and of officers appointed by the militia by these governments, and attach the both of them to the militia, it may be affirmed with the greatest assurance that the throne of every tyranny in Europe would be speedily overturned in spite of the legions which surround it. Let us not insult the free and gallant citizens of America with the suspicion that they would be less able to defend the rights of which they would be in actual possession, and the debased subject of arbitrary power would be to rescue theirs from the hands of their oppressors. Let us rather no longer insult them with the superstition that they can ever reduce themselves to the necessity of making the experiment by a blind and tame submission to the long train of insidious measures which must precede and produce it. The argument under the present head must be put to a very concise form, which appears altogether conclusive. Either the mode in which the federal government is to be constructed will render it sufficiently dependent on the people, or it will not. He likes this form of argument. He's like, you're asking the wrong questions. Do you want the government run by the people, or do you want it not? On the first supposition, it will be restrained by the dependency of forming schemes obnoxious to their constituents. On the other supposition, it will not possess the confidence of the people, and its schemes of usurpation will be easily defeated by state governments, who will be supported by the people. On summing up the considerations stated in this paper and the last paper, they seem to amount to the most convincing evidence that the powers proposed to be lodged in the federal government are as little formidable to those reserved to the individual states as they are indispensable, necessary to accomplish the purposes of the Union, and that all the alarms which have been sounded of mediated consequential annihilation of the state governments must, on the most favorable interpretation, be ascribed to the chimerical fears of the authors of them. Publius. Oh, man. All right, so we're starting a new subject, which is going on, it looks, for quite a few. I think I will call it there, because I don't want to start a new subject line. I think the next 3 or 4 are going on to a new subject line. I don't have time to read 3 or 4. So I think I will call it slightly early. I will be back next week. We will start on Federalist 48. We will get into the 50s next week for sure. I might try to jump on tomorrow and try to get this next section. I want to get to 50 soon, but it's getting late. I'm getting tongue-tied here because I'm getting tired. So if you're interested in hearing more of the Federalist Papers, talking about the Federalist Papers, you can jump in. People can jump in and talk about it, but I'm done for the night. So follow if you want to watch it next week. I'll try to get on tomorrow if I can, but I will be back next Wednesday. Throw a like. I'd appreciate it. Thanks, guys. Y'all have a great one.